The night was so dark that even the waves seemed to disappear into it. In the early months of the Pacific War, somewhere between the Solomon Islands and the shadowed mass of New Guinea, a Japanese destroyer group cut across the water in tight formation. Their engines rumbled softly beneath the wind, and every lookout strained into a black horizon that revealed nothing. Night had always been Japan's domain, a place where their crews trained to move unseen, strike unseen, and vanish before the enemy understood what had happened. But tonight, the darkness didn't stay loyal. A sudden streak of light tore across the void. Then another. Thin, glowing lines rose from the far edge of the sea, arcing with mechanical precision. To Japanese eyes, they looked unnatural, as if the ocean itself had begun drawing lines of fire in midair. American bullets. Tracers. A technology the Japanese knew existed, but had never seen unleashed with such volume, such clarity, such purpose. For the first time, night no longer hid them. Instead, it revealed their silhouettes with every passing second, and that realization spread across the decks like a cold breath. And it was in that moment that the broader story of nighttime warfare in the Pacific truly began. Long before tracer fire carved light through the Pacific night, both Japan and the United States had already shaped their own philosophies of how darkness should be fought. The decades leading into the Second World War turned the night into a battlefield of its own, one that favored whichever navy understood it better, trained for it longer, and built the technology that could overcome it. For Imperial Japan, night combat was not merely a supplemental skill. It was a strategic identity. From the 1920s onward, the Imperial Japanese Navy trained its destroyer and cruiser crews relentlessly under low-light conditions. Officers memorized silhouettes under starlight. Lookouts practiced identifying ship classes by the shape of the mast against cloud-covered skies. Gunnery crews drilled until they could manually adjust bearings with only limited illumination. The logic was simple. If they could master the night, they could neutralize America's overwhelming industrial strength before daylight exposed their disadvantages. By contrast, the pre-war U.S. Navy did not give the night the same reverence. American doctrine prioritized fleet engagements fought in daylight, with battleships forming the backbone of victory. Night training occurred, but inconsistently, and often without the precision exercises that had become routine in Japan. While U.S. commanders recognized the usefulness of illumination rounds and star shells, they had not yet built a culture around dominating the darkness. In the 1930s, the American fleet still believed the decisive battles of the next war would unfold under the sun. This contrast would become painfully clear in 1942. As the Pacific erupted into full war after Pearl Harbor, Japan moved quickly. Their early advances were swift and disciplined, supported by crews who maneuvered confidently under moonless skies. Japanese destroyers, equipped with the Type 93 long-lance torpedo, one of the most formidable weapons of the era, could strike from ranges that astonished Allied observers. Nighttime became the Empire's hunting ground. American task forces that entered these waters soon realized they were facing opponents who treated darkness not as an obstacle, but as an ally. Crucially, Japan's mastery was tied not only to skill, but to expectation. Their entire strategic doctrine assumed that night battles would allow their smaller fleet to overcome America's industrial edge. They believed surprise, aggression, and torpedo superiority would compensate for whatever the U.S. could produce. And in the opening months, this belief seemed justified. Yet beneath the surface, the balance was already shifting. Even before the war, American ammunition developers had experimented with tracer rounds, small caliber and heavy caliber bullets, containing chemical compositions that ignited during flight, leaving a bright visible streak. They were originally intended for aircraft gunnery training, allowing pilots to visually guide fire toward moving targets. But naval officers soon recognized their value at sea, especially in conditions where visibility was poor and immediate feedback could change the outcome of an engagement. By the time U.S. forces began contesting the Solomons and New Guinea, tracer ammunition was becoming increasingly standardized. Machine gun nests aboard destroyers and cruisers received belts loaded in patterns. Ball, armor-piercing, tracer, repeating in disciplined rhythm. Larger guns also adopted illuminating components that helped crews adjust fire with unprecedented speed. What Americans had not yet mastered in night maneuvering, they compensated for with rapidly improving tools. Still, in early 1942, technology alone was not enough. The U.S. Navy suffered several early nighttime setbacks because radar integration, communication discipline, and ship-to-ship coordination lagged behind Japanese experience. Many American ships entered combat with radar sets that officers had not fully learned to trust. Others lacked the practiced reflexes that Japanese crews demonstrated instinctively. But change came quickly and violently. The brutal series of engagements around Guadalcanal forced the U.S. Navy to adapt at a pace no one had anticipated. Every clash revealed a weakness to correct. Radar procedures tightened, tactical doctrines were rewritten, and fire control teams trained relentlessly to integrate radar bearings with visual cues like tracer arcs. American commanders began treating the night not as Japan's eternal advantage, but as a solvable challenge. It was during this transformation that tracer rounds became more than mere ammunition. They became a language, a visible marker of American coordination, a guide that cut through uncertainty, and a psychological weapon that illuminated not only enemy targets, but the shadows in which they once hid. By late 1942, the U.S. Navy was no longer entering night battles blind. Radar contacts, combined with patterns of tracer fire, allowed formations to quickly locate and overwhelm Japanese ships. The darkness that once concealed attacks now worked in reverse. Every returning burst of American tracers revealed Japanese silhouettes with terrifying clarity. This shift, technological as much as tactical, placed Japan in a position it had not expected. Their night training, though superior, could not compensate for tools that effectively erased the battlefield they had relied upon. And as 1943 approached, both navies understood that the night was changing shape. The struggle for its control had only begun, and it was this changing environment that set the stage for the next layer of the story. The shifting balance of night warfare did not happen in isolation. Throughout 1942 and into early 1943, the Pacific theater became an enormous test ground where competing doctrines, weapons, and technologies collided. Every island, every convoy, every narrow strait carried evidence that the character of nighttime combat was evolving, and that the U.S. Navy was adapting far faster than Japanese strategists anticipated. The waters around the Solomon Islands offered some of the most intense examples. Here, geography itself dictated the kind of fighting both sides were forced into. Narrow channels, inconsistent moonlight, and sudden rain squalls made visibility unpredictable. What had once been an environment that favored Japanese night-trained crews gradually became a proving ground for Americans learning to combine radar, gunnery, and illumination rounds into a single synchronized system. Central to this transformation was radar-directed fire control. Early American radar sets, cumbersome, temperamental, and sometimes distrusted, matured quickly as officers discovered how indispensable they were during night engagements. Radar could detect incoming ships long before lookouts spotted silhouettes. It provided bearing and range information that could be fed directly into gun directors. And when tracers streaked out to confirm the radar's position estimates, fire correction accelerated in a way that manual methods could never match. This synergy between radar and tracers was not accidental. American naval planners recognized that reliable visual feedback would reinforce their mechanical data. Radar could find an enemy, but tracers could reveal the shape and motion of that enemy to every gun crew on deck. The two systems, working together, compensating for each other's limitations, gradually merged into a doctrine that replaced the traditional reliance on human lookouts. Japan, meanwhile, faced an entirely different problem. Their night training had always depended on human senses, eyesight, hearing, intuition, practice pattern recognition. Japanese destroyer crews were among the best in the world at interpreting faint horizon changes, smoke trails, and nearly invisible outlines. But no amount of training could compensate for radar-guided American tracers that turned uncertainty into precision. What Japanese commanders had refined over decades suddenly became vulnerable the moment U.S. rounds illuminated the sea in sweeping arcs. The psychological impact was unmistakable. Reports from Japanese officers noted the increasing visibility of American gunfire and expressed frustration that enemy projectiles traced their path with unnatural clarity. They recognized that tracers allowed American gunners to correct fire instantly, in some cases achieving accuracy within seconds of opening fire. The difference between hitting a target after a full salvo or adjusting aim 3 rounds could decide an entire battle in the narrow waters of the Solomons. But technology alone did not drive the change. American operational philosophy was also shifting. By mid-1943, U.S. commanders had accepted that the Pacific War demanded flexibility, speed, and constant refinement. No longer were large battle groups expected to fight in perfect formation. Small task units learned to maneuver aggressively at night, using radar to maintain spacing and using tracers to coordinate fire across multiple ships. Gunnery officers conducted night practices with increasing frequency, perfecting the skill of adjusting fire based solely on the luminous streaks of outgoing rounds. As doctrine changed, so did the materials themselves. The U.S. Army and Navy Ordnance Departments refined tracer compositions to burn brighter, farther, and more consistently. Improved incendiary mixtures extended visibility, allowing gunners to track bullet paths at ranges that would have been impossible only a year earlier. Ammunition belts were standardized, ensuring predictable tracer intervals. Even aircraft-mounted guns began firing patterns designed to visually lead ship-based gunners onto targets, an early form of combined arms nighttime coordination. All of this reshaped Japanese assumptions. They had long believed that night battles would remain their domain, a continuation of their interwar doctrine in which speed, skill, and torpedoes compensated for America's industrial advantage. But the new American tracer doctrine, paired with radar and evolving tactics, turned the night into a contested zone. What had once been Japan's advantage became progressively neutralized, not through greater experience, but through rapid technological evolution. By early 1943, Japan still held pockets of night superiority in isolated encounters, yet the overall trend was unmistakable. Each engagement revealed more clearly that American forces were closing the gap, not slowly, but with remarkable acceleration. And as both sides braced for larger clashes to come, analysts in Tokyo began to realize that the Americans were no longer simply reacting. They were innovating. They were learning from every loss and synthesizing new methods with every battle. The night itself was no longer predictable. This changing battlefield, shaped by doctrine, technology, and the shifting balance of capability, sets the foundation for examining the deeper angles of the story. For behind every tracer streak, every radar ping, and every illuminated silhouette stood human decisions, technological choices, and strategic visions that define the Pacific War's most critical turning points. And it is through these angles that the full magnitude of Japan's shock and America's ascent becomes clear. On paper, tracers were simple, a bullet with a burning compound that glowed during flight. But in practice, they became one of the most tactically decisive elements of American night fighting. Their value extended far beyond the visual effect. In darkness where even silhouettes vanished, tracers served as the frontline form of real-time communication between gunners, officers, and entire formations. When a ship opened fire, the glowing arcs instantly revealed the direction and alignment of its guns. Other vessels in the formation did not need radio confirmation or voice commands to understand the target. The trajectory told the story. It showed where to concentrate fire, where to shift, and where enemy ships were attempting evasive maneuvers. In the confines of the Solomon Islands, where every engagement risked confusion, tracers created order within chaos. Correcting aim became dramatically faster. Instead of waiting for shell splashes or relying solely on radar plotters, American gunners could visually observe their bullet paths and adjust within fractions of a second. The feedback loop compressed. Shots that once required multiple salvos to fine-tune could be corrected almost immediately. This rapid adaptation mattered enormously in night battles defined by speed and fleeting opportunities. Moreover, tracers helped prevent friendly fire. In the darkness, ships could easily misidentify targets or misalign their batteries. Tracers drew visible boundaries across the sea, a glowing indicator of which sectors were already engaged. For formations maneuvering at high speed, this immediate clarity often meant the difference between coordinated assault and dangerous confusion. This tactical clarity stood in stark contrast with Japanese night fighting methods, which still relied heavily on unlit gunfire, torpedo launches, and human observation. American tracers cut through that uncertainty, giving U.S. forces the ability not just to fire, but to orchestrate complex engagements under conditions where Japan had once enjoyed almost total dominance. And this orchestration, simple in appearance, profound in impact, was one reason Japanese commanders began noticing that the night, once predictable, was shifting under their feet. Behind every glowing streak across the Pacific sky lay a chain of decisions rooted in American industry, chemistry, and ordnance engineering. U.S. tracer ammunition evolved rapidly from pre-war concepts into standardized, high-performance munitions that offered impressive reliability compared to earlier designs. The burning effect came from carefully balanced compositions, often mixtures of strontium salts, magnesium, and oxidizers, designed to ignite after a short delay and burn bright enough to remain visible at combat ranges. Engineers refined the mixtures so the burn would not destabilize the bullet in flight or prematurely reveal gun positions during certain engagements. Achieving this balance required rigorous testing and manufacturing precision. Standardization played a key role. By mid-war, American forces relied on predictable tracer ratios within ammunition belts, typically one tracer for every 4 or 5 ball or armor-piercing rounds. This ensured consistent visual feedback without overwhelming a gun crew's ability to interpret what they saw. Larger naval calibers adopted similar principles through spotting rounds and illuminating components that helped adjust the fire of main batteries, even in total darkness. The United States, industrial scale, amplified this effect. Factories could produce millions of rounds with uniform quality, allowing ships and aircraft across the Pacific to rely on tracers with confidence. This reliability contrasted sharply with Japan's wartime production strain. The longer the conflict continued, the more difficult it became for Japan to match the technological consistency and output of American munitions. From a purely technical perspective, tracers symbolized the broader industrial disparity between the two nations. Japan's night fighting doctrine had been sharpened through years of disciplined training, but America's ability to mass-produce high-quality tools, from radar systems to ammunition types, meant that U.S. forces could continually refine their capabilities while Japan struggled to maintain what it already had. The technological progression of tracers demonstrated that even small innovations, when multiplied through an enormous industrial system, could reshape the dynamics of an entire theater. And as these innovations reached the decks of American ships in increasing quantities, Japan's commanders found themselves confronting more than glowing lines in the dark. They were confronting a symbol of the industrial momentum defining the war. For Japanese commanders, the first time American tracers cut through the darkness was not merely a visual surprise. It was a strategic shock, a direct challenge to decades of doctrine built on the assumption that Japan controlled the night. Japanese night training emphasized invisibility. Ships moved with minimal lighting, gunners relied on sensitive optical devices, and officers taught crews to fight without the crutches of artificial illumination. Their torpedo attacks, built around the capability of the long lance, depended on approaching undetected, unleashing salvos, and escaping before the enemy could react. Darkness was supposed to hide them, shelter them, and provide the element of surprise. But tracers changed that. The moment American rounds illuminated the sea, the Japanese illusion of invisibility fractured. Escape routes became obvious. Maneuvers that once disappeared into the night were suddenly outlined by the faint glow reflecting off spray and superstructures. Even when American rounds missed their targets, the light they produced revealed Japanese positions to every U.S. gunner within range. Japanese reports described this effect with growing frustration. Commanders wrote that the enemy's fire traced their own ship movements, making concealment nearly impossible. Others noted that American accuracy improved noticeably once tracers began flying, suggesting that the enemy had adopted a new method of correcting aim that Japanese crews could not counter. What unsettled them most was not simply the brightness of the tracers, but the realization that their own night fighting strengths relied on conditions that no longer existed. The dark had been their shield. Now it was perforated with every burst of American gunfire, and this sense of sudden vulnerability would only intensify as the conflict progressed, setting the stage for even deeper human, psychological, and doctrinal consequences. For the sailors who lived these moments, the appearance of tracer fire in the night was not an academic shift in technology. It was an emotional shock that altered the rhythm of battle. Night engagements had always been tense, but for Japanese crews accustomed to the comforting anonymity of darkness, the sudden intrusion of light created a new form of psychological pressure. American tracers revealed more than bullet paths. They revealed vulnerability. A ship that had moments earlier felt concealed in the silent expanse now watched glowing arcs reach toward it, each line a reminder that someone, somewhere in the darkness, could see them clearly. Even when the rounds missed, the effect remained. Crews on deck became aware that every movement was potentially visible, every silhouette suddenly exposed. Human instinct magnified the tension. Bright streaks cut across peripheral vision, making it harder for lookouts to maintain composure. The eye followed every luminous curve, distracting from established procedures. Japanese officers wrote of startled reactions among younger sailors witnessing tracers for the first time. These accounts noted that men who were steady under normal fire became momentarily paralyzed by the contrast of light and dark. For Americans, the psychological effect was different. Tracers offered reassurance. Gun crews saw their fire guiding through the night and felt the confidence that comes with control and clarity. The fear of shooting blind diminished. Officers coordinating multiple guns or multiple ships could visually confirm alignment without shouting orders over already crowded channels. The night became less intimidating when every burst of tracers reaffirmed visibility. This contrast, Japanese anxiety and American confidence, created a psychological imbalance that affected decision-making. Hesitation crept into Japanese torpedo deployments. Maneuvers that required precise timing faltered when tracers illuminated positions prematurely. Night actions that once favored Japanese initiative now imposed mental strain, eroding the calm decisiveness their doctrine required. Human reactions, shaped by flashes of light in the Pacific darkness, became one of the invisible forces influencing battle outcomes, a reminder that war is not fought only through machines, but through the minds of those operating them. Leadership on both sides viewed nighttime combat through different lenses. Japanese admirals, particularly Isoroku Yamamoto and Genichi Mikawa, believed deeply in the Empire's night-fighting legacy. Their doctrine assumed that well-trained crews using long-lance torpedoes could shatter enemy formations before dawn. Decisions from Tokyo supported aggressive night tactics, emphasizing independent destroyer groups and stealthy cruiser strikes. But the American approach evolved rapidly under the pressures of Guadalcanal and the Solomons. Leaders like Admirals Raymond Spruance, William Halsey, and Norman Scott recognized early that Japan's head start in night fighting had to be countered with disciplined adaptation. They pushed radar operators to refine procedures, demanded better integration between ship systems, and encouraged innovative training that paired radar with visible indicators like tracers and star shells. This divergence in leadership philosophy became strikingly visible at sea. Japanese commanders often hesitated to adopt new technologies, believing their long-standing human-centered doctrine remained superior. Radar sets were installed on some vessels, but underused, and gunnery corrections still depended heavily on optical observation. American commanders, meanwhile, leaned into change. Radar contacts were accepted as authoritative. Fire control officers gained greater autonomy. Tracer rounds became intentional tools of coordination rather than incidental byproducts of gunfire. Leaders emphasized constant learning, revising tactics after every engagement instead of rigidly repeating past methods. As these doctrinal shifts took hold, the night itself changed meaning. To Japanese strategists, it remained a familiar environment they hoped to exploit. To Americans, it became a puzzle to be solved, and solved quickly. Leadership on both sides shaped the evolving character of the conflict, but only one side embraced innovation at the pace required to dominate the shifting terrain. The result was a strategic divergence that widened with every confrontation, setting both navies on paths that converged violently in the central engagements of 1943. The environment of the Pacific played its own decisive role. Few naval theaters in history offered such unforgiving conditions as the Solomon Islands chain. Narrow channels, volcanic silhouettes, sudden storms, and moon cycles created unpredictable visibility. Small errors turned deadly in confined waters where ships could appear or vanish within moments. Before the rise of American radar and tracer-guided tactics, these conditions heavily favored Japan. Their night-trained crews maneuvered confidently through areas like Iron Bottom Sound, the Slot, and the twisting approaches to Guadalcanal. Japanese destroyers delivered torpedoes at long ranges with deadly precision, often escaping before American forces could respond. But as tracers and radar matured, the same environment flipped in favor of the U.S. Navy. In the dense waterways of New Georgia, where darkness once shielded Japanese movements, American tracers cut through the blackness and revealed entire formations in seconds. Radar pinpoints combined with tracer corrections allowed U.S. ships to engage at distances previously impossible at night. The claustrophobic waterways that once hid Japanese destroyers offered fewer advantages when glowing rounds illuminated their wakes and superstructures. Even in the open expanses around the Bismarck Sea, tracer fire guided American aircraft and ships as they coordinated attacks on Japanese troop convoys. The bright streaks helped pilots align strafing runs and alerted naval gunners to shifting enemy positions. Tracers served as visual anchors in battles where visibility changed minute by minute. Environmental complexity, once Japan's greatest ally, became neutralized by American enhancements. The geography did not change, but the tools did. And with each engagement, The Pacific's nights became less of a sanctuary and more of a battlefield where American coordination and clarity steadily outmatched Japanese stealth. The moment the horizon filled with carriers. The fog of morning had barely lifted when the Japanese reconnaissance pilot spotted something unusual. Long, flat shapes, barely visible through the haze, arranged in a pattern too deliberate to be mist or clouds. He leaned forward, squinting, expecting perhaps a cruiser group, maybe even a pair of carriers. But as the sun rose, the outlines multiplied. 1, then 2, then 5, then an entire wall of flat tops emerging from the gray Pacific. What he was looking at should not have been possible. For months, Japanese sailors believed American carriers operated cautiously, striking, retreating, repositioning, never showing their full weight. Yet here they were, an armada stretching so far across the horizon that it seemed to erase the ocean itself. Flight decks ran in parallel lines like floating airfields. Aircraft were already warming up, wings unfolded, engines thundering in synchronized rhythm. Below, Japanese destroyer crews froze at their stations. Officers rushed to binoculars. Men shouted elevation coordinates. No one had trained for this sight. American carriers not hiding, but advancing openly, confidently, as if daring the Imperial Navy to stop them. This was no raid. This was a declaration. And in that instant, Japan realized the war had changed shape forever. The shockwave through the Imperial Navy. Word of the sighting raced through Japanese command channels faster than any shell or torpedo. Officers gathered around plotting tables, staring at the reports with disbelief. The Americans were not supposed to have this many carriers operational. Not after the early disasters. Not after months of fierce attrition. Yet every confirmation from every scouting plane said the same thing. The U.S. Navy had shown up in force. A force larger than anything Japan had ever prepared to face. On the destroyers closest to the approaching fleet, sailors felt the tension like static in the air. The ocean was calm, but the atmosphere vibrated with a distant rumble of synchronized carrier operations. Aircraft were taking off in steady intervals, rising into the sky like a mechanized swarm. The sound was unnerving, rhythmic, confident, relentless. Some Japanese gunners tightened their grip on their weapons, not out of courage, but because their hands were trembling. Others watched silently, realizing that each American plane lifting into the air represented more than firepower. It represented industrial might, something Japan could no longer match. The carriers kept coming. The horizon widened with steel, flight decks, and aircraft. It felt less like a fleet and more like a moving coastline. And in that overwhelming moment, Japan understood a brutal truth. This was the turning point, the moment the Pacific no longer belonged to them. The engagement they could not stop. The first American strike wave surged forward before Japanese commanders could fully process what they were facing. Radar aboard U.S. carriers painted a clear, sweeping arc of aircraft moving in perfect formation. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters flew together in a coordinated mass, something Japan had mastered early in the war, but now saw reflected back at them with amplified American precision. On the bridge of one Japanese cruiser, officers tracked the oncoming dots on the plotting board. They were too many, approaching too fast. Their interceptors, already stretched thin and lacking fuel reserves, would not be able to stop them all. When the American aircraft broke through the clouds, the sea lit up. Anti-aircraft batteries fired desperately, stitching the sky with black puffs of shrapnel. The gunners knew their shells were rising into a storm too large to disperse. American pilots dove with disciplined accuracy. Angles calculated, timing synchronized, attack ladders practiced endlessly in the Solomon Islands, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and the Marianas. Every second felt louder than the last. Bombs released. Torpedoes dropped. Engines screamed through the haze. A Japanese destroyer vanished in a column of water and fire. A cruiser burned along the stern, listing as men scrambled across the deck. Every explosion was another confirmation of what the commanders feared. This wasn't just an attack. It was a demonstration of complete naval dominance. And above the chaos, still distant yet visible on the horizon, the American carriers remained untouched. Their decks kept launching waves, second, third, fourth, each one tighter and more efficient than the last. For Japanese observers, it felt like watching a dam break and flood the ocean with steel. There was no pause, no hesitation, no gap to recover. This was the moment the Imperial Navy realized that the war they had once commanded with daring raids and fast carriers had now shifted into an arena where speed, experience, and bravery were no longer enough. The Americans had grown too strong, too coordinated, too numerous. The shock of seeing carriers line an entire horizon was no longer just visual. It was tactical, psychological, existential. And the battle unfolding in front of them made that reality impossible to deny. The destruction, however, was only half of the story. What followed next would cement the turning point with chilling clarity. When darkness became visible, nightfall should have offered cover. In previous battles, Japanese ships relied on it. Shadows to conceal movements, torpedoes to strike unseen, the invisible hand of darkness as their ally. But this time, the darkness itself betrayed them. American tracer rounds streaked through the night like silver ribbons, arcing over the decks, along the waterline, and across the wakes of fleeing ships. Every vessel, every torpedo boat, every cruiser silhouette was suddenly outlined in blazing light. No maneuver could hide from it. No evasive action could erase the glowing paths that mapped their positions to enemy gunners. Japanese commanders barked orders, but their words fell into the hum of exploding rounds. Ships zigzagged, trying to escape, but the tracers followed relentlessly, correcting American aim in real time. Radar-directed fire combined with visible guidance made every Japanese formation predictable, every motion apparent, every attack anticipated. The scale of American coordination was staggering. Carrier decks continued to launch successive waves of aircraft, each one guided by the precision of lights and radar. Anti-aircraft fire, once the Japanese confidence at night, was now reactionary, ineffective, and terrifyingly visible. Tracers did not just hit, they informed. They instructed. They dominated. For the first time in the Pacific, Japanese crews faced a night they could neither control nor hide in. Hours of training, decades of doctrine, all the faith in a long-lance torpedo, it was not enough. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the psychological and tactical shift was complete. American firepower, visibility, and coordination had rewritten the rules of night combat. Japan's dominance. The first light of morning revealed a stark and unforgiving reality. Japanese commanders surveyed the remnants of their once formidable formations and understood, with chilling clarity, the scale of the defeat. Ships that had advanced confidently under the assumption of night superiority now floated crippled or burned, their decks blackened, their superstructures twisted by torpedo hits and bombs. Destroyers that had been integral to Japanese night tactics were missing entirely. Cruisers were ablaze, their anti-aircraft guns silent, crews trapped or scrambling for cover. American reports confirmed the toll. Several Japanese vessels were sunk outright, while others limped away, heavily damaged and incapable of returning to immediate combat. Aircraft losses were comparatively lower for the Americans, a testament to the combination of superior coordination, radar guidance, and tracer-directed accuracy. Every successful American strike had been amplified by lessons learned in prior engagements, where radar and tracers were integrated into an almost mechanical rhythm of war. But beyond the statistics, the psychological shock was equally profound. Japanese officers admitted in later reports that the sheer visibility of American firepower erased the protective cover of night and made traditional tactics almost irrelevant. Crews that had relied on stealth now realized their movements were illuminated in real time, their every maneuver visible, and their lives increasingly exposed. Confidence, the intangible force that had underpinned night operations, faltered in a way that would affect morale long after the engagement ended. Even commanders like Admiral Mikawa, once celebrated for daring nighttime tactics, found themselves forced into reluctant withdrawals, unable to match the speed, firepower, and coordination displayed by the Americans. Plans meticulously designed for concealment and surprise had been rendered obsolete. Tracers had not only mapped the battlefield, but also rewritten the assumptions of combat. Meanwhile, American forces emerged not only victorious, but vindicated. The effectiveness of radar, combined with tracer-guided gunnery, demonstrated that technological adaptation and rigorous training could overcome even the most experienced enemy. Lessons from Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and New Guinea had been applied decisively. Ships and aircraft coordinated with precision previously unimaginable. Each successful strike reinforced the credibility of doctrines that emphasized integration of technology, visibility, and rapid tactical response. The tangible outcomes were measurable. Japanese losses, both in ships and aircraft, far outstripped the damage sustained by American forces. But the intangible outcomes were equally significant. Night, once Japan's domain, was now a contested space where technological advantage could outweigh decades of experience. For the first time, American forces could operate under the cover of darkness not as timid survivors, but as dominant aggressors, shaping the battlefield in real time with both light and fire. This shift would resonate in every naval engagement that followed. Japanese commanders, once confident in their ability to dictate night operations, now had to account for an enemy who could see through darkness, correct fire instantaneously, and coordinate attacks with unprecedented efficiency. The cost of overconfidence was stark, and the calculus of the Pacific War had shifted in measurable and irrevocable ways. The aftermath of the engagement revealed not just a tactical victory, but a turning point in naval doctrine. American forces had proven that mastery of technology, combined with disciplined coordination, could neutralize traditional advantages of stealth and experience. The night that once concealed became a tool of control, and the battlefield itself, previously opaque, was now illuminated by lines of tracer fire stretching across the horizon. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over burned decks and floating wreckage, it became evident that the Pacific would never again belong to those who relied solely on darkness for dominance. The stage was set for a new era of warfare, one in which innovation, coordination, and adaptability determined not just the winner of a single night, but the outcome of entire campaigns. The strategic ripple. The consequences of that night extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Japanese naval planners, still reeling from the shock of tracer-guided American fire, began to reassess their entire approach to night operations. The assumption that stealth alone could secure victory was no longer viable. Reports from surviving officers repeatedly emphasized the unsettling efficiency of American coordination. Every maneuver exposed, every position known. These accounts highlighted a stark reality. Experience and training, even at their peak, could not offset the combined advantage of industrial output, technological innovation, and disciplined adaptation. Losses were significant and measurable. Several destroyers and light cruisers had been sunk or irreparably damaged, critical for Japan's night torpedo attacks. Aircraft losses compounded the problem, as Japanese pilots lacked both the numbers and the tactical visibility to mount an effective response. Meanwhile, American forces had sustained relatively minimal casualties, demonstrating the growing asymmetry of night engagements. Tracer-guided fire, combined with radar-directed strikes, had allowed U.S. commanders to conserve assets while maximizing enemy damage. The psychological and strategic impact was equally profound. Confidence in previously unassailable tactics eroded rapidly. Commanders on deck and in Tokyo alike began to recognize a sobering truth. The night could no longer be considered a Japanese advantage. Doctrine that had once dictated aggressive, confident nocturnal maneuvers now required revision, adaptation, or outright abandonment. Japanese ships increasingly hesitated to engage without daylight support, and new training programs were hastily instituted to attempt parity with American methods, but the gap was widening. For the Americans, the engagement reinforced a doctrine that had emerged from hard lessons. Night was no longer a domain of uncertainty. It could be mapped, managed, and dominated. Tracer rounds, once secondary to training and visualization, became a core tactical tool. Radar-guided coordination enabled gunners to engage with precision, even in low-visibility conditions, while aircraft strikes, synchronized with naval fire, effectively overwhelmed traditional Japanese defenses. The integration of technology, training, and operational planning demonstrated that industrial and scientific advantage could transform psychological perception and battlefield control. Long-term, the engagement accelerated a broader strategic shift in the Pacific. Japanese reliance on night superiority and surprise torpedo attacks was increasingly neutralized. The U.S. Navy, emboldened by success, refined its doctrines, further integrating radar, tracers, and coordinated aircraft carrier operations into standard practice. Subsequent battles, from New Georgia to the Bismarck Sea, bore the imprint of these lessons. Each encounter confirmed that the psychological edge, once firmly Japanese, had shifted decisively. By late 1943, Japanese assessments acknowledged a stark transformation. The U.S. had not merely matched Japanese capability at night, they had exceeded it. Every night, engagement risked exposure, miscalculation, and loss. Confidence, once a cornerstone of Japanese naval doctrine, was replaced by caution, hesitation, and the necessity of defensive posturing. Conversely, American crews moved through darkness with calculated assurance, guided by visible evidence and technological support, turning uncertainty into opportunity. The human, tactical, and technological consequences of this shift would influence the remainder of the Pacific campaign. The night, once an ally for Japan, became a battlefield the Americans could manipulate and control. Tracer-guided fire transformed not only the mechanics of combat, but also the psychology of those under its reach. By illuminating both the enemy and the path forward, it signaled a profound change in the war's trajectory. The Imperial Navy's dominance of the Pacific had been challenged, and the balance of naval power was irrevocably altered. In a vast expanse of the Pacific, night had once been a sanctuary, a cloak under which strategy, skill, and tradition could triumph over raw industrial power. For Japan, darkness was a trusted partner, honed over decades of disciplined training and careful doctrine. But the events that unfolded, traced by streaks of glowing American bullets, revealed an immutable truth. War is as much a contest of adaptation as it is of courage. The tracer rounds that illuminated the Japanese fleet were more than tools of destruction. They were symbols of a broader reality. The combination of technological innovation, industrial capacity, and disciplined execution could redefine the battlefield itself. In the blink of an eye, the very fabric of Japanese naval dominance was transformed. What had been invisible became visible. What had been safe became perilous. And in that sudden clarity, the psychological advantage shifted irrevocably. Human perception, instinct, and experience were challenged in new ways. Sailors accustomed to mastery of darkness confronted a reality where every movement was observable, every tactic counterable, and every decision measured under the harsh light of American innovation. Confidence gave way to caution, intuition to calculation. The night, once a haven, became a mirror reflecting the limits of even the most skilled naval power. Yet for the Americans, the spectacle of tracers stretching across the horizon signified more than victory. It represented mastery through learning, adaptation, and industrial foresight. Each illuminated path was a lesson applied, a process refined, a doctrine confirmed. In the chaos of war, clarity had emerged not by chance, but through deliberate planning and relentless execution. History remembers this transformation not merely as a tactical turning point, but as a profound shift in the nature of naval warfare. Night battles, once governed by stealth and tradition, became contests of visibility, coordination, and technological edge. The Pacific, vast and dark, was no longer a passive stage. It was a dynamic theater, shaped as much by light as by shadow. And in that light, humanity glimpsed a universal truth. In war, as in life, adaptation determines survival. Those who illuminate the unknown do more than see. They shape the course of history.